The scent of damp rot filled Silas's lungs. He stood in the center of his small cabin, looking up at the main roof beam that held the weight of his world. A long, dark crack snaked through the pine, a grim portent of the coming winter. His immediate goal was to replace it before the first heavy snow, but the decay was far worse than he had anticipated. If he failed, the roof would collapse under the snowpack, leaving him with nothing but canvas and cold mercy in the high Rockies. He ran a hand over the rough wood, feeling the soft, spongy decay that crumbled under his fingers. This was not a simple repair. This required a new log, properly seasoned and cut, a task too great for one man with a handsaw and an axe. He had come to these mountains seeking solitude, a quiet penance for a life of noise and failure back east. He had planned meticulously for self-sufficiency, but he had not planned for the slow, relentless power of moisture and time. The beam was a testament to his oversight. It was a failure he could not afford. The first flakes of snow had already been seen on the highest peaks, a silent warning. He had a week, maybe two, before the trails became impassable. He had to go to the settlement. He had to ask for help. The journey was a descent into a world he had tried to leave behind. He packed his mule, securing the small sack of coins he had left. His provisions were carefully rationed, but an unexpected delay could prove disastrous. The trail followed Whisper Creek, its sound a constant companion as he moved from the deep quiet of his own valley into the slightly more traveled paths below. The golden leaves of the aspen trees shivered in the wind, a stark and beautiful contrast to the dark green of the pines. He saw the tracks of deer, and once, the large print of a bear, a reminder that he was only a guest in this vast wilderness. He felt a familiar tension settle in his shoulders, the strain of anticipating interaction, of having to explain himself to people who would surely ask questions. He had come here to be unknown. By midday, the trees thinned, and he saw the faint wisp of wood smoke rising into the crisp autumn air. The settlement of Harmony was not much more than a wide spot in the valley, a dozen buildings clustered around a general store, and a blacksmith shop. It was a place built on necessity and cooperation, two things he had once understood, but now felt estranged from. He tied his mule to the hitching post in front of Vance's general store, the simple act feeling like an admission of defeat. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful, unwelcome announcement of his arrival. An older man with a kind, weathered face looked up from behind the counter. His name was Elias Vance. Silas nodded, his voice raspy from disuse. "I need lumber, a main beam for a cabin roof, and I was hoping your blacksmith could forge some support braces." Elias wiped the counter with a slow, deliberate motion. "The lumber I can help you with. Got some good seasoned pine stacked out back. But Jacob, our blacksmith, he headed east to see his sister. Won't be back until the spring thaw." Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The simple plan had fractured. Now he was just a man with a broken home and dwindling options. He bought the log, arranging to have it delivered by a young man with a sturdy wagon the next day. The cost took more than half his remaining coins. As Elias wrote up the sale, Silas noticed the ledger on the counter showed only a handful of transactions for the month of October. This was a quiet place, a world away from the bustling commerce he had fled. He also bought flour, salt, and coffee, the simple necessities feeling like an indulgence. As he was packing his supplies, a woman and a young boy entered the store. She was dressed in a simple patched dress, but she carried herself with a quiet dignity. The boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, had serious eyes that seemed to miss nothing. They approached the counter, and the woman spoke to Elias in a low voice. He shook his head regretfully. "Still no word on that shipment of wool, Sarah. The weather has the freight wagons running slow." The woman's shoulders slumped, a barely perceptible motion. The boy, Leo, looked at the candy jar on the counter, then quickly looked away, his face a careful mask of indifference. Silas found himself watching them, a strange ache in his chest. He saw a struggle that mirrored his own, a quiet battle against the coming cold. It was a fight for survival waged not with axes and rifles, but with dwindling supplies and fading hope. Anyone listening in the quiet of their own home understands the weight of a long winter. Silas finished loading his mule and turned to leave. He gave a slight nod to the woman, a gesture she returned with a flicker of surprise. Outside, the air had grown colder. He looked up at the mountains that ringed the valley, their peaks already white. He had come here to be alone, to prove he could stand on his own. Yet here he was, reliant on a delivery wagon and a blacksmith who was hundreds of miles away. The problem of the support braces remained unsolved. He could try to fashion them from wood, but they would never have the strength of iron. It was a risk, another potential point of failure. He made camp a few miles outside of town, not wanting to impose or draw attention. As he sat by his small fire, eating a meager meal of hardtack and dried meat, he thought of the woman and her son. He thought about the careful emptiness of her pantry that he had glimpsed past her shoulder in the store. His own solitude was a choice. Hers, he suspected, was a circumstance. The wind whispered through the pines carrying the scent of snow. He had his own problems, more than enough to occupy his mind. But the image of the boy's face, so full of unspoken longing, stayed with him. He had sought isolation to heal his own wounds. He had not considered the wounds of others. The next morning, the delivery wagon arrived at his cabin site, pulled by two strong mules. The driver, a young man named Daniel, helped Silas unload the heavy beam. It was a fine piece of timber, straight and solid. The land deed for his plot carries an old stamp from the territorial office, a mark of legitimacy he clung to. Now he had to prove he was worthy of it. Daniel looked at the cracked beam in the cabin. That's a bad one. Seen a roof go under a heavy snow. It isn't a pretty sight. Silas simply nodded, the warning unnecessary. He paid the young man, who then turned his wagon around and headed back toward Harmony. The brief moment of human contact was over. Silas was alone again with his impossible task. He spent the next 2 days preparing. He used a system of levers and ropes to carefully remove the old rotten beam, the cabin groaning in protest. The structure was dangerously unstable now, a skeleton open to the sky. He worked from dawn until dusk, his muscles aching, his hands raw. Without the iron braces, he knew he had to devise another way to secure the new beam. He would use wooden pegs and carefully carved notches, an old method that required precision and patience. It was the work of a craftsman, not a surveyor. His old life had been about lines on paper, about abstract calculations. This was about wood and grain, about the tangible reality of shelter. As he worked, he found his mind drifting back to the store, to the woman named Sarah and her son Leo. He wondered what her story was. Harmony was a small community. A single woman with a child would be a subject of quiet speculation. On the third day, as he was measuring the final cuts for the notches, he saw a figure approaching on the trail. It was the boy, Leo. He was carrying a small bucket. The boy stopped a respectful distance away, his gaze fixed on the half-dismantled cabin. Silas put down his saw and walked over. "You're a long way from town, son." Leo held out the bucket. "Ma sent this. She said you bought supplies and she figured you might not have had a warm meal in a while." Silas looked inside. It was a thick, hearty stew, still warm. Steam rose from it, carrying the scent of rabbit and herbs. He was struck speechless for a moment. He had expected nothing from this community and had offered nothing in return. This simple act of kindness felt like a bridge across a chasm he had dug himself. "Thank your mother for me. It's very kind of her." The boy nodded, his eyes taking in the massive new beam lying on the ground. "You building this all by yourself?" "Yes." Leo seemed to consider this. "My pa was a builder. He built our house before he got sick." The boy's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, but Silas heard the deep well of loss beneath it. The small offering of stew was no longer just a meal. It was an echo of a life that had been, a connection to a shared human experience of building and losing. Silas shared the stew with the boy. They sat on a log, eating in a comfortable silence. When they were finished, Leo stood to leave. "My mom, she's worried about our fence line, the one up by Willow Creek. The marker post is gone, and she says Mr. Thorne is grazing his cattle further over than he ought to." Silas knew the name. Marcus Thorne was the largest landowner in the valley, a man who had built his prosperity through shrewd and sometimes ruthless dealings. A dispute with him was not a small matter. "My ma has the deed, but the map she has is old, hard to read." Leo looked at Silas directly. "Mr. Vance said you used to make maps." The statement hung in the air. It was an offering, a trade, a warm meal for a particular skill, a problem for a solution. Silas thought of his own past, of the maps he had drawn that had led to financial ruin for good men who had trusted him. The memory was a fresh wound. "I'm not a map maker anymore." The boy's face fell. "Oh, okay." He picked up the empty bucket. "Well, thanks for the stew." He turned and started down the path. Silas watched him go, a small, solitary figure against the vast backdrop of the mountains. He could let him walk away. He could return to his work, to the safe, predictable world of wood and tools. It was what he had come here to do, but the boy's quiet request had disturbed his carefully constructed peace. It was a problem he could solve, a wrong he might be able to right. He looked at his own half-finished cabin, a symbol of his own precarious existence. Maybe survival wasn't just about building walls. Maybe it was about mending fences too. "Wait!" Silas called out. The boy stopped and turned, his expression hopeful. "Maybe I could take a look at that map." Leo's face broke into a wide grin. The change was so complete it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. It was a light Silas had not seen in a very long time. It made him feel a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He had a home to build and a winter to survive. But suddenly his world had become a little larger than the small plot of land he called his own. The following day, Silas finished setting the main beam. He used a complex arrangement of ropes and his mule to painstakingly hoist the massive log into place. It settled into the notches with a solid, satisfying thud. The cabin was stable again, the skeleton now strong and ready for the rest of the work. It was a victory, but a temporary one. He still needed to finish the roof and chink the walls. As he worked, he thought about his promise to Leo. Late in the afternoon, he cleaned himself up as best he could and made the journey back toward Harmony, this time taking a less traveled path that led to the small homestead where Sarah and Leo lived. Their cabin was smaller than his, but it was well kept. A neat stack of firewood stood by the door. In a small garden, now dormant, showed signs of a diligent hand. Sarah met him at the door, her expression a mixture of surprise and caution. Leo stood just behind her. "Mr. Silas, my son said you might be willing to look at our property map." She seemed hesitant, as if regretting her son's boldness. "I said I would," he replied, keeping his voice even. Her caution was understandable. He was a stranger, an outsider. Trust was not given freely in these parts. She invited him in. The inside of the cabin was sparse but clean. A fire burned in the stone hearth, casting a warm glow on the room. Sarah laid 2 documents on the small wooden table. The first was the deed to her 40 acres, the paper brittle with age. The second was a hand-drawn map. Silas picked it up carefully. It was old, the ink faded. The landmarks were simple sketches of trees and rocks, things that could change or disappear over time. The property line in question was a faint, wavering line that ended near a drawing of a split boulder by a creek. The trading post ledger shows 3 names from last winter who tried to find that same boulder and failed. "This is the problem," Sarah said, pointing to a spot on the map. "This is Willow Creek. The deed says our property runs to the center of the creek. Mr. Thorne claims the line is 20 yards on this side of it. That 20 yards holds the only good pasture on our land. Without it, our milk cow won't make it through the winter." The stakes were clear, and they were as high for her as his collapsing roof was for him. Silas studied the map, then the deed. The language in the deed was specific. It mentioned a survey marker, an iron pin set in the ground. The split boulder was a reference point, not the boundary itself. The map is a guide, not a legal document. The deed mentions a survey pin. That's what matters. Have you looked for it? Sarah sighed. My husband James and I looked for it years ago. We never found it. We think it was washed away in the flood of '79. Everything changed after that flood. The creek shifted its course. Mr. Thorne's father and my James had a gentleman's agreement about the line. But Marcus Thorne doesn't believe in gentleman's agreements. He believes in fences. And his fence is on our pasture. It was a common story. Nature changed the land, and men fought over the new lines. Silas felt the old instinct stirring within him. This was a puzzle of angles, distances, and lost points of reference. It was the very work he had sworn to abandon. I have a surveyor's chain and a compass at my cabin. I can't promise anything. But I can take new measurements. I can try to find where that pin should be. Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his face. Why would you do that? You don't know us. Silas hesitated. Because your son brought me stew when he didn't have to. It was the simplest truth. It was the only one that mattered. The room was quiet, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Anyone can feel the warmth of a fire on a cold day. But this was a different kind of warmth. A faint hope appeared in Sarah's eyes. She nodded slowly. All right, Mr. Silas. We would be grateful. As Silas prepared to leave, Leo approached him, holding a small carved wooden bird. My pa made these. He gave it to Silas. For luck. Silas closed his hand around the small object. It felt smooth and solid. It felt like a promise. He walked back to his cabin under a sky full of stars, the weight of the bird in his pocket a strange and unfamiliar comfort. He had a roof to finish, but now he had another task. He had to find a small iron pin, buried for years, that held the future of a family. For the next week, Silas divided his time. Mornings were for his cabin, afternoons for the survey. He worked on his roof, fitting the boards, covering them with sod. It was slow, hard labor, but with each completed section, he felt a growing sense of security. The cabin was becoming a home. In the afternoons, he would take his tools to Sarah's property. He started from a known corner marker, a large pile of stones mentioned in the deed. From there, he used his compass and chain to measure out the distances and angles described in the document. It was exacting work. He had to account for the magnetic deviation of the compass and the unevenness of the terrain. Leo often followed him, watching silently as Silas drove stakes into the ground and made notes in his journal. The boy never asked many questions, but his presence was a constant reminder of what was at stake. One afternoon, as Silas was working near the creek, Marcus Thorne rode up. He was a large man in his 40s with a hard, unsmiling face. He sat atop a fine horse, looking down at Silas and his equipment. You're the fellow from the abandoned Miller cabin. I'm Silas. Thorne's eyes narrowed. This is my land you're trespassing on. According to Mrs. Miller's deed, her property extends to the creek. I'm simply verifying her claim. Thorne scoffed. The creek moved. That line is old news. The fence is the line. The fence is where I say it is. The crate on Thorne's wagon bears a mine mark that matches the seal on his land grant, a sign of his established power. His claim was backed by presence and force. Silas met his gaze calmly. A deed is a legal document, Mr. Thorne. A fence is just wood and wire. I suggest you let me finish my work. Thorne stared at him for a long moment, a silent battle of wills passing between them. Silas did not look away. Finally, Thorne grunted and pulled his horse's reins. Find whatever you want. It won't change a thing. He rode off, leaving a palpable sense of menace in the air. Leo, who had been hiding behind a cluster of willows, came out. He looks mean. He is, Silas said quietly, but that doesn't make him right. The confrontation solidified Silas's resolve. This was no longer just a favor for a neighbor. It was a matter of principle. It was a stand against a bully who used his power to intimidate those with less. The next day, Silas's calculations led him to a thicket of overgrown brush about 10 feet from the creek bank. According to his measurements, the pin should be somewhere in this area. He and Leo spent hours clearing the brush, their hands getting scratched and torn. They found nothing but rocks and dirt. Sarah came out with a jug of water for them. Her face was etched with worry. Any luck? Not yet. But my numbers say it should be here. It's possible the flood buried it deep. He took a long drink of water, feeling a familiar sense of frustration. He had followed the procedures, trusted his instruments, but the physical proof remained elusive. It felt like his old failure all over again, a perfect plan on paper that didn't match the reality on the ground. Despair began to creep in. He had made a promise he might not be able to keep. He sat on a rock, looking at the disturbed earth. Leo was poking a stick into a patch of soft mud near the base of a large cottonwood tree. The stick hit something with a dull thud. "What's this?" the boy asked. Silas walked over. He knelt and began to dig at the spot with his hands. A few inches down, his fingers brushed against cold, hard metal. He dug faster, his heart pounding. Slowly, he uncovered a rusted, pitted piece of iron driven deep into the ground. It was the survey pin. It had been there all along, protected by the roots of the old tree. The flood that had washed away the soil around it had also ensured its anchor held fast. They had found it. Sarah let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She knelt beside Silas, her hand hovering over the pin as if it were a sacred relic. For the first time, Silas saw the full weight of her burden lift. Leo whooped with joy. It was a moment of pure, unblemished triumph. The truth had been right there, just waiting for someone patient enough to uncover it. Their celebration was cut short by the return of Marcus Thorne. He had evidently been watching from a distance. He dismounted and strode over, his face a thunderous mask. "What is that?" "That," Silas said, standing up, "is the official survey marker for this property line." Thorne stared at the iron pin, then at the creek. His new fence was a good 20 yards on Sarah's side of it. He was silent for a long time, the muscles in his jaw working. Then he looked at Silas, his eyes cold with fury. "This changes nothing. That pin could have been put there yesterday. I have my surveyor's notes. My measurements are based on the original plat filed at the county seat. This is not a matter of opinion." For a moment, Silas thought Thorne might resort to violence. The man's hands were clenched into fists. But then Thorne seemed to deflate, the anger replaced by a sour resignation. He knew he was beaten. The evidence was irrefutable. "Fine. I'll move the fence. But don't think this makes you a hero. You're still an outsider. And you've made an enemy today." He turned without another word, mounted his horse, and rode away. Sarah looked at Silas, her eyes shining with tears of gratitude. "How can I ever repay you?" Silas shook his head. "There's nothing to repay. Seeing the look on your son's face is payment enough." He felt a sense of satisfaction so profound it almost startled him. It was a feeling he had not experienced in years. It was the feeling of having done something right, something that mattered. He had used his old skills not for profit or ambition, but to help someone in need. It was a small act of redemption, played out on a forgotten patch of land in the high mountains. He walked back to his cabin as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley. The air was cold and clean. For the first time since his arrival, he did not feel like a man in exile. He felt like a neighbor. He looked at his own cabin, the new beam a strong, straight line against the twilight sky. It was almost finished. He had a home, a real home. And he was beginning to understand that a home was more than just a roof over your head. It was about the connections you forged, the fences you mended, and the small, quiet acts of courage that defined a life. The mountains around him seemed less like a judgment and more like a sanctuary. He was finally learning to live in this new place, not just exist in it. The first snow fell a week later. It came silently in the night, a thick white blanket that transformed the world. Silas woke to a profound quiet, the familiar sounds of the forest muffled by the snow. His cabin was finished. The new beam held strong. The roof was sound, and a steady fire in the hearth kept the small space warm and secure. He had chinked the last of the logs with a mixture of mud and moss just 2 days before. He had done it. He had survived his first test. He looked out the small window at the pristine landscape, a feeling of deep peace settling over him. He was ready for winter. Life settled into a new rhythm, dictated by the snow and the cold. Silas spent his days chopping wood, checking his trap lines, and reading the few books he had brought with him. The solitude he had once craved now felt different. It was not an escape, but a choice. It was peaceful, not lonely. Once a week, he would make the trip to Harmony for supplies and news. His relationship with the townsfolk had shifted. He was no longer the mysterious stranger from the Miller cabin. He was Silas, the man who had helped Sarah Miller. He was greeted with nods and quiet respect. Marcus Thorne ignored him completely, which was a victory in itself. Thorne had moved his fence, his silent, grudging admission of defeat visible for all to see. Silas often stopped at Sarah's homestead on his way to or from town. He would help her with heavy chores, chopping wood or repairing a leaky shed roof. In return, she would share a warm meal with him. They talked easily, sharing stories of their past. He learned that her husband James had been a good man, a carpenter who had died of a fever 2 years prior, leaving her to raise Leo and manage the small farm alone. She learned of Silas's life in the city, of his work as a surveyor for a railroad company, and of the bridge collapse that had shattered his reputation. A miscalculation in his survey of the riverbed had led to a faulty foundation. Lives were lost. Though he was officially cleared of blame, the weight of it had driven him to seek this quiet, anonymous life. It feels good to hear a voice that understands failure. Many people who have never failed do not know how to be kind. Sarah's quiet acceptance was a balm on a wound he thought would never heal. He and Leo developed a bond. Silas taught the boy how to read a compass, how to identify animal tracks in the snow, and how to carve wood. He saw in Leo a quick mind and a steady hand. The boy's quiet seriousness was tempered by a deep curiosity about the world. He was a good kid, and Silas found himself feeling a protective, almost fatherly affection for him. One evening in late November, a fierce blizzard swept through the valley. The wind howled, and the snow fell so thick that it was impossible to see more than a few feet. Silas was secure in his cabin, the fire roaring. He was not worried for himself, but he found his thoughts turning to Sarah and Leo. Their cabin was older and more exposed than his. He hoped their woodpile was high and their pantry was full. The storm raged for 2 days. When it finally broke, the world was buried under 4 feet of snow. The silence was absolute. Silas spent the morning digging a path from his door to his woodshed. The work was exhausting. By midday, he decided he had to check on Sarah and Leo. He strapped on the snowshoes he had made from bent willow and sinew and began the trek. The journey, normally an hour's walk, took him 3. The snow was deep and soft, and the familiar landscape was rendered alien and treacherous. When he finally reached their homestead, his heart sank. A large portion of their cabin roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow. A gaping hole looked up at the gray sky. He found them huddled in the small, intact portion of the cabin, wrapped in every blanket they owned. A tiny fire sputtered in the hearth, providing little warmth. Sarah's face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "A beam cracked," she said, her voice trembling slightly. It happened in the middle of the night. It was the same beam James had always meant to replace. Leo was shivering, trying to be brave. Silas's own recent struggle with his cabin beam flashed in his mind. He knew exactly how close he had come to this same fate. There was no time for pity. "You can't stay here. Pack what you can carry. You're coming back with me," Sarah protested, but there was no strength in her voice. She knew he was right. They gathered what little they could: food, blankets, and a few personal items. Silas took the heaviest load. The journey back was even harder. He practically had to carry Leo the last half-mile. When they finally stumbled into his cabin, they were exhausted, cold, and demoralized. But they were safe. The warmth of the fire enveloped them. Silas made them hot coffee and a thick stew. They ate in silence, the unspoken terror of the last few days hanging in the air between them. Sarah looked around the small, sturdy cabin, at the solid new beam overhead. "You built this well." "I had a good reason," he said, his eyes meeting hers. It was a simple statement, but it held a world of meaning. The blizzard had not just broken her home. It had broken down the last of the walls between them. They stayed with him. The small cabin, built for 1, now housed 3. It was crowded, but it was not uncomfortable. They fell into a domestic routine. Silas hunted and chopped wood. Sarah cooked and mended clothes. Leo did his lessons and helped with chores. It felt natural, right? The evenings were spent by the fire, reading or talking. The work became their world. February bled into a relentless cycle of frigid dawns and exhausted evenings. The valley, once a collection of isolated homesteads, transformed into a single, determined organism. Silas moved through it like a nerve center, his notes and calculations the language that bound them all together. He learned the shape of the land not from a map, but from the burn in his thighs as he climbed a ridge, from the feel of frozen earth through his worn boots. He learned the names of every child, the story of every family's arrival, the specific anxieties they held for the 20 or 40 acres they called home. He saw the cost of their unified effort. He saw it in the chapped, bleeding hands of the women who held the survey chain, their fingers stiff with cold. He saw it in the weary faces of the men who spent their days clearing sight lines with axes, their nights tending to their own dwindling resources. He saw it in Leo, who ran messages until he nearly dropped. his young face set with a seriousness that belonged to an old man. They were pouring the last of their winter reserves, both physical and material, into this one desperate gamble. Failure was a possibility Silas refused to entertain in their presence, but it was a cold companion in the quiet hours before dawn. Marcus Thorne did not remain idle. His men were a constant presence at the edges of their work, mounted figures watching from distant hills, their silence more unnerving than any open threat. They never interfered directly, but their surveillance was a steady psychological pressure. Twice, survey stakes Silas had placed were pulled up overnight. Once, a carefully built signal cairn on a high pass was found dismantled. These were petty acts of sabotage, meant to slow them and sow discord. Instead, they galvanized the community. Each act of malice was met with a quiet, stubborn resolve. They replanted the stakes. They rebuilt the cairn, larger this time. They were no longer just neighbors. They were a bulwark against a common enemy. The final piece of the survey was the most dangerous. It was the long, contested line that bordered Thorne's own vast ranch. This was the boundary from which all his power emanated. The line he had expanded through intimidation and legal trickery for years. As Silas and a team of 6 men, including Old Ben, began to work their way along the creek bed, Thorne appeared. He was not alone. He had 4 riders with him, hard men with rifles resting easily in their saddles. Thorne reined in his horse, blocking their path. "This nonsense ends today. You are on my property, surveyor." Silas drove a wooden stake into the frozen ground with a small mallet, his movements deliberate. "According to the original territorial plat, Mr. Thorne, and according to the new measurements we have just taken, this stake is 10 yards inside the Harmony community line. Your fence is on our side." Thorne's face darkened with rage. He looked past Silas at the other men. "Are you all blind? Are you going to let this stranger, this railroad failure, lead you to your ruin? He's a charlatan, filling your heads with false hope so he can get his hands on the Miller woman's land." The accusation hung in the frigid air. It was a poisoned dart aimed at the heart of Silas's credibility. For a moment, Silas felt the old shame rise, the ghost of the collapsed bridge. Then he looked at Ben's steady, weathered face. He looked at the other men, their hands calloused, their expressions tired but firm. They did not waver. Ben took a step forward, his voice a low rumble. "Silas is one of us now, Marcus, and we trust his numbers more than we trust your fences." The simple declaration was a shield. The poison had found no purchase. Thorne's eyes narrowed to slits. He seemed to recognize that his power here, the power of fear, was gone. He looked from face to face and saw not frightened homesteaders, but a united front. "This is a mistake. You will all regret this." He wheeled his horse around, his men falling in behind him. They rode off, not in triumph, but in a stiff, angry retreat. No one celebrated. They simply watched him go, then turned back to the work. The stake was in the ground, the line was drawn. They finished the map 2 weeks before the March 1st deadline. It was a work of art, a testament to their collective will. Drawn on 3 large pieces of tanned hide stitched together, it showed every property in the valley, every creek, every ridge, every fence line, all cross-referenced with a ledger containing affidavits signed or marked by the head of every family. They had built their ark. Now they could only wait for the flood and pray for a savior. He arrived on the last day of February, a lone rider appearing as a dark speck against the vast white expanse, growing steadily larger. He was not the territorial marshal they had sent for, but a deputy, a man named Reed, younger than Silas had expected, with a lean face and eyes that missed nothing. He carried the weariness of a long, hard ride and the unyielding authority of the law. He accepted their petition, his expression unreadable as he listened to Elias Vance explain the situation. He then nailed his own notice to the door of the general store. A public hearing would be held the next morning. All claimants were to be present. Marcus Thorne's name was at the top of the list. The general store was packed, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and anxious humanity. Deputy Marshal Reed sat behind the counter, a makeshift judge's bench. Silas's map was unrolled upon it, a declaration of defiance. Thorne stood near the stove, flanked by a lawyer from Denver, a man in a city suit that looked utterly out of place. The proceedings began. Thorne's lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth and condescending. He spoke of legal precedent, of clerical errors, of the unreliability of old surveys. He painted the community's effort as a kind of peasant uprising led by a disgraced and unqualified outsider. Then Reed turned to Silas. "Mr. Silas, your response." Silas stepped forward. He did not feel like a man in exile. He felt like a man defending his home. He spoke simply, clearly. He explained the methodical process of the new survey. He pointed to the map showing how the small, cumulative errors of the original survey had resulted in significant discrepancies that Mr. Thorne had exploited for years. He presented the ledger of affidavits, a chorus of voices backing the map's authority. It was then that Thorne played his final card. His lawyer produced a file. It contained a detailed report of the Union Pacific Bridge collapse of '78. He read from it, his voice dripping with false sympathy, detailing the faulty survey, the shifted foundation, the loss of life. He concluded by looking at Silas. "This is the man you are trusting with your homes, a man whose errors have already cost lives. Is that a risk you are willing to take, Marshal?" The room fell silent. Every eye was on Silas. He could feel Sarah's gaze, could feel the weight of the entire valley's hope resting on his shoulders. He looked directly at Deputy Reed. "It is true. I was the chief surveyor on that project. I was cleared of any official wrongdoing, but that doesn't matter. A mistake was made. My mistake. And I have lived with it every single day since." He paused, his voice dropping but gaining intensity. "And it is because I have lived with that failure, Marshal, because I know the cost of a single, miscalculated degree, that this map before you is the most accurate, most painstakingly verified survey this valley has ever had. I have measured every line on it not once, but 3 times. My past is not a reason to doubt this work. It is the reason you can trust it completely." His confession, his ownership of the failure, changed the energy in the room. It was not the statement of a charlatan, but of an honest wounded man. Reed held Silas's gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at the map, at the faces of the homesteaders, and finally at Thorne's smug expression. He spent the next hour examining the map, comparing it to Sarah's deed and a half-dozen others. He asked Silas pointed, technical questions, which Silas answered with calm precision. Finally, he straightened up. "This court finds the original survey of Harmony Valley to be demonstrably flawed." He picked up a pen and a small official seal from his bag. He then moved down the counter to the map. He signed his name at the bottom with a flourish, then pressed the seal into a pool of hot wax next to his signature. "Pursuant to Territorial Law 11B, I hereby certify this new survey. Provisional titles based on this document are granted to all signatory families, effective immediately. They will be recorded as permanent upon the spring circuit." He looked at Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, you will have 30 days to move your fences to the legally recognized lines. This hearing is concluded." A collective breath was released. A quiet cheer went through the crowd, growing into a wave of triumphant relief. Thorne stood frozen for a moment, his face a mask of disbelief. He had been beaten, not by a loophole, but by the truth. He and his lawyer pushed their way through the celebrating crowd and disappeared. No one watched them go. They were too busy shaking Silas's hand, clapping him on the back. The men, the women, their faces wet with tears of gratitude. Sarah reached him, her eyes shining. She simply placed her hand on his arm, a touch that said more than words ever could. In the midst of the crowd, Silas felt a profound sense of peace. He had not erased his past, but he had finally, truly redeemed it. Spring came to the valley like a promise fulfilled. The snow receded, revealing the green shoots of new life. The sound of running water from the creeks replaced the deep silence of winter. The air grew warm, filled with the scent of damp earth and pine. It was a season of rebuilding. All across the valley, people worked on their homes, their fences, their fields, with a renewed spirit. There was a new sense of connection, a bond forged in the crucible of the Great Survey. Marcus Thorne's power was broken. He moved his fences, a public and humiliating concession. He retreated into his large ranch, a diminished figure, his influence withered by the community's unity. He was no longer a feudal lord, just a man with a great deal of land and no one's respect. The valley had found it could survive without his permission. Silas, Sarah, and Leo worked together to rebuild her cabin. With help from their neighbors, the work went quickly. They laid a new foundation, stronger than the old one. They raised new walls and, using the lessons Silas had learned on his own cabin, set a massive new roof beam into place, securing it with pegs and newly forged iron braces from the returned town blacksmith. As he worked alongside her, Silas found that the careful, hesitant terms of their future had melted away with the snow. One evening, they sat on the porch of the nearly completed cabin, watching the last of the sun's light paint the high peaks in shades of orange and pink. Leo was down by the creek, skipping stones. "It's a good house," Sarah said quietly. "It will be a good home," Silas replied. He turned to look at her. The caution that had always guarded her eyes was gone, replaced by a soft, open trust. "Our home," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. It was not a question. It was a statement. Silas reached over and took her hand. His was rough and calloused from a winter of work. Hers was strong and capable. Their fingers interlaced, a simple, perfect fit. "Yes," he said, "our home." Later, as twilight settled, Silas walked the short path back to his own cabin. He stood before it, looking at the solid lines, the sturdy roof, the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. He had come to this place seeking an ending, a quiet place to serve out his penance in solitude. He had built walls to keep the world out, but the world had found its way in, not with noise and judgment, but with the offering of a bowl of stew, the trust of a small boy, and the courage of a community. He had found that a home was not a place to hide. It was a place to belong. He opened the door and stepped inside into the warm waiting light.